Hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome back to Victimology. How's everyone doing? How's everyone's week? Okay, great. I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear everyone's doing well. So today we will be talking about chapter 14. We'll be talking about secondary victimization. So secondary victimization isn't all that chapter 14 was about, but because secondary victimization wasn't discussed as much as it should have been within the text, then I did want to take this time in class to discuss secondary victimization and what secondary victimization is. But before we get into secondary victimization, let's just take part in a small activity. So I want you to brainstorm on some reasons why victims may not report their victimization. And I know that we've done this activity in the past. However, this time I want you to make a connection between the criminal justice system and why individuals do not report their crime. The crime that they were a victim of. So, what connection is there? What part does the criminal justice system play in victims not reporting the crimes they were victims of? So, I'll give you about a minute or so while I pull up the PowerPoint so we get ready for our lecture. Okay, so can anybody give me some of the ideas that they came up with? Okay, so you say that a victim's previous experiences with law enforcement may impact whether they report the victimization or not. Okay, perfect. I think that's a great answer. So what you're saying is, what you're hinting at is that if an individual has a negative experience with law enforcement, then they may distrust law enforcement. So they may not feel comfortable enough to report a victimization. They may even feel as if nothing might be done if they report that victimization, or they might not be believed. I think that's a great answer. So, does anybody else have another idea as to why victims may not report their victimizations as it relates to the criminal justice system? Okay. Okay, so you think that it's because they're afraid that the case might go to trial? Definitely. Absolutely. So if a case goes to trial, of course, there is that chance that the victim might have to come in contact with the offender again. So that might bring back past trauma. So there are many other reasons why victims may choose not to report their victimizations as it relates to the criminal justice system. So I am going to show a video that discusses some of those reasons before we get into the actual lecture. But before I play that video, I do want to let you all know that I'll be showing two videos throughout the presentation. And if at any point in time you do feel uncomfortable, and you feel as if you need to, walk away, maybe log off and log back in, you can definitely let me know if there's any supplemental material that needs to be sent. I'll send it via email. And if you want to see the video later on, just let me know. Either way, they will be posted in Canvas. So you can just go back in Canvas and go into the module for this week, and you can watch the video through there if you like as well.
I was advised that a lot of things about me would be brought up in court that I might not necessarily want people to know, that they'd bring up sexual history, they'd speak to my friends, they'd speak to my family, they'd get photos of me on Facebook and even perhaps analyze what I was wearing in certain situations.
I consider myself lucky because I'm one of the few victims who managed to actually have a conviction against the perpetrator. And so I think the statistics are 6% of reported rapes results in a conviction in England and Wales, and actually only about 15% of rapes are reported. So the statistics are pretty damning and actually horrifying in a lot of ways.
And those reasons can range from so many, from feeling like we won't be believed,
fear of causing a fuss or just not being believed, or nothing's going to come of it. And it's quite stressful to tell people that you're close to, let alone strangers in a police station.
When it happened to me, I spent the first few days denying that anything bad had happened. And it wasn't for another month before I actually felt I need to go and report this. But of course, by that point, no physical evidence, and very much a he said, she said situation.
And if I were to lose the case, which they said was more likely, I would have to pay the legal fees, which as a student, I never would have been able to afford. It's something that even 2 years on, I'm still dealing with today. I felt like I never really got justice for myself. And this person is married, and I know that he has 4 young children. He's still perhaps doing the same job. I feel like I'm the one that's being punished.
My rapist was arrested about 5 or 6 days after the assault, and he didn't plead guilty. So that meant that 11 months from then, there was a trial that had been scheduled. So I had to kind of wait 11 months for this trial to happen. And it was like my life was on hold, effectively. And it was an awful experience for me, because just the thought of having to testify in person in great detail about your rape in the same room as your perpetrator is terrifying, right? And I can't imagine, actually, if you sat through that whole process and then you still didn't get a conviction, that must be incredibly damaging in terms of, and it must have an impact on your ability to recover in some ways.
About 6 years ago, I was sexually assaulted by a very senior person, and then reported that to the police. The power imbalances of someone high profile who was seen as a reliable witness, it being all about one person's word against other people's word. And if someone has more power and status, then the likelihood is that they're going to be believed by the jury and get found not guilty.
When I was researching for my novel, I ended up observing a number of rape trials. Oftentimes when victims are being questioned, there were all these reactions from clerks. You know, I remember clerks saying, like, well, I didn't really think she's telling the truth. You know, and I don't think she's telling the truth. And I would ask her, well, why do you think that? And they'd say, well, she's not really acting the way like a rape victim would act. But how do you know how rape victims are supposed to act? You know, I think, unfortunately, we go, maybe because of movies and TV, we have this image of how rape victims are supposed to be. They're supposed to be weak and vulnerable and cry and maybe be a little bit feminine and not be too strong. But if they seem too put together and too articulate, well, then maybe they're not actually telling the truth, right? Because they don't seem distressed enough. It's a little bit ignorant, because in reality, people react in all different ways. People of all different personality types become victims. So your personality and your attitude towards the world is going to affect the way that you testify.
I think that I wish that I'd known to go to the police sooner. Although it's really difficult to speak out, especially to strangers, I think that if you feel like you can, it's so important, because it only strengthens your case being brought to justice.
It's not always perfect, but I do think it's important for people to be engaging with it if they can.
So my advice would be seek advice from other people who really understand the system, and really weigh it up. Don't feel that you're in any way responsible. Don't take the burden of, you know, creating a better society on yourself, because I think your first duty is to yourself and to your mental health.
I was advised that a lot of...
Okay, so as we can see, the two ideas that you all brought to my attention were mentioned within the video. So we are going to go through what was discussed in the video in great detail. So to begin, what is secondary victimization? So apart from the fact that it's not found in many of the victimology textbooks, it is a result of the response of others to victims and their experience. It's not a direct result of the crime. It's more so how others react to what the victim has been through. And it can ultimately lead to victims, it could ultimately lead victims to refuse to participate in the case, and they may choose not to report their victimization in the future. But it's very important not to confuse secondary victimization with a secondary victim or with re-victimization. A secondary victim is a person who's present at the scene of the act of violence and injured as a direct result of witnessing the crime. Re-victimization is when a person experiences abuse more than once throughout their lifetime. So, who can cause secondary victimization, or who can exacerbate secondary victimization? So secondary victimization can be caused by family, friends, criminal justice personnel, medical or mental health professionals, social service providers, media, and society. So really anyone who can have an opinion on what the victim has been through can have an effect on the victim's experience with secondary victimization. So how does secondary victimization happen? What behaviors can encourage secondary victimization? So to begin, just by exposing a victim to a suspect or offender multiple times can be secondary victimization because you're making the victim relive this trauma over and over and over again. This happens a lot throughout the criminal justice system. Also, blaming a victim for the victimization that has occurred, that's also a form of secondary victimization. Excessively interrogating the victim about their experience is also a way to promote secondary victimization, and making insensitive or inappropriate comments about the victim in their presence can also cause secondary victimization. And finally, denying necessary services to victims after the victimization, such as denying counseling and support groups, can also have an impact on secondary victimization. So the primary source of secondary victimization is the criminal justice system. Secondary victimization can be experienced through criminal justice procedures, through court proceedings, and through treatment by members of the criminal justice system. So how can criminal justice personnel affect victims? So they can affect victims through dismissive or insensitive responses, or through a lack of empathy for the victim's experience. They can also do so by failing to adequately follow up with the victim after the crime. And research has found that police officers and doctors actually frequently underestimate the impact that they can have on a victim, well, the impact that their actions can have on a victim. So police officers often do not believe that how they react to a victim or how they treat a victim can cause secondary victimization. So how can police promote secondary victimization? Well, before we can discuss this, let's discuss what the role of police is. Not in secondary victimization, but in general. What is the role of police after victimization has occurred? So the role of police is to address the victim's concerns. The police is actually the victim's initial encounter. The initial encounter they have with the criminal justice system is police. For most times, it's actually the only encounter that they have with the criminal justice system. And the role of the police is, as I said, to address victims' immediate needs for emergency services. It's to provide referrals for victim services. It's to tell victims about their rights, to explain to the victim what the criminal justice process entails and what it looks like. But most victims don't even get this. Most victims aren't knowledgeable of the criminal justice system or the proceedings that go within the criminal justice system. So what happens when a victim isn't told any of this information by police? They experience secondary victimization. They feel as if they're not important enough for the police to be giving them this type of information. They feel as if they're not being taken seriously. And research suggests that interactions between victims and police have improved, but there are ongoing problems. Police actually have the responsibility of deciding if a crime was committed and if the victim's account of their experience is credible. So the issue here is, if a victim is questioned, if their credibility is questioned, and the crime is not deemed a crime, then where does that leave the victim? How is the victim going to feel about their victimization? Again, they'll feel like it's not important, like it doesn't matter, like they don't matter. And studies both in the United States and the United Kingdom have found that many rape cases are dropped after a police officer decided that the offense didn't constitute a criminal offense. These decisions have an influence on the victim, and the decisions themselves are actually influenced by factors that might not even be related to the actual facts of the crime. It can be related to age, race, socioeconomic status, level of distress, as mentioned in the video, history of substance abuse. Studies have found that a very important predictor of PTSD symptoms and rape victims is a negative interaction with law enforcement. Criminal justice proceedings. So, how do criminal justice proceedings affect a victim? So, secondary victimization can be a result of criminal proceedings themselves. It can be a result of a victim's perception of unfavorable outcomes in criminal justice proceedings. So, what do victims want? So, what do I mean by an unfavorable outcome? So, victims want the court to punish in a sufficiently severe manner. So, they want the offender to be punished the same way that they were victims. Well, not the same way, but as severely. Victims want to feel secure. So they want the offender to be punished enough so they feel like the offender will not come back and retaliate against them for reporting the crime. They want the prevention of re-victimization. They also want recognition that they were a victim of a crime. What victims don't want are light sentences and sentences that focus on rehabilitation. So, with this being said, in the next couple of slides, we will be talking about court proceedings, trial procedure. But before we do this, I do want to show you a video of an individual who went through the whole process of reporting the crime and, taking the case to trial. And just pay attention to what she says. Again, if you do feel uncomfortable while this video is being played, you can definitely, step out. You can log out of the Zoom and then log back in. I believe the video is about 8 to 10 minutes. So if you want to log out for 8 to 10 minutes and then come back, you can definitely do that if you would like.
For some people, going to court and confronting the man who raped you is difficult, but ultimately empowering. For me, I have never felt more ashamed, degraded, and powerless in my life.
I pictured this moment differently. I waited 3 years, 10 months, and 1 day before I addressed my rapist in court. I thought I would feel stronger or a sense of accomplishment. Instead, I felt like I had barely survived the legal system. I felt even more broken than I already was to begin with. I got justice, but it sure didn't feel that way. I decided to document my experience going through the legal system as a survivor, to give a glimpse into what this process is actually like, capturing the back and forth travel from where I live in New York City to where the assault happened in Los Angeles, logging video diaries, and recording my victim impact statement from inside the courtroom all took place within the last 2 years of the process.
That's why we're here today. Because of what you did almost 4 years ago, the night you raped me. What I want you to know is how insignificant, less than human, and broken I have felt as a result.
For every 1,000 people who are raped in the US, only 230 of them report their rape, and fewer than 5 perpetrators will ever be put behind bars. My rapist was one of them. In 2014, I was a junior in college celebrating the end of final exams. A man who I didn't know drugged me at a local college bar and took me to his apartment. He sexually assaulted me while I was incoherent. And a day later, I found out he had taken videos of what he had done to me while I was unconscious. At first, I barely even realized what had happened. But I knew if he did this to me, it was only a matter of time until he did it again to someone else. I decided to report him to the police.
I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of you doing this to another woman and getting away with it. I felt responsible to report my rape. It's not the right decision for everyone, but for me it was.
I thought filing a police report, having video evidence, and getting a rape kit done would be enough for people to believe me. It wasn't. A rape kit can provide DNA evidence when a sexual assault has occurred. The process involves standing naked on a piece of butcher paper while nurses collect DNA samples and take pictures of your body, followed by an internal examination with lots of poking, prodding, and swabbing. It's a highly invasive exam that takes hours to complete. As horrible as it was, I had to do it if I wanted any chance of this going to court. I waited 6 months for my case to even get picked up by the district attorney at the LA County Sex Crimes Unit, after they decided it was strong enough to hold up in court. And while I'm forever grateful for this, I quickly learned the reality of my situation, that the justice system isn't set up to protect survivors. I became my own advocate. I would have to call to get updates on hearings about my own case, only to be left devastated after being told it was postponed again. I would have to calm myself down after having a private investigator follow me and confront me at my place of work. He came and found me in the newsroom and presented me with papers basically saying that the defendant is asking for my phone records. At one point, I flew myself out to LA to beg a judge to stop granting my perpetrator's wishes to postpone hearings. In the court process, you're assigned someone to help you. They're your DA, a public official who acts as a prosecutor on behalf of the state. But they're overworked and understaffed. I would put all of my faith and trust and questions into this person, and I would finally feel some sense of control or understanding. But I ended up having to work with 4 different DAs, each time having to rebuild that relationship all over again and come to terms with the fact that yet again another stranger knew these embarrassing facts about me.
I don't remember what it's like to be living in a never-ending nightmare. I'm not the same young woman you took advantage of in December 2014.
It's confusing to fight to see an end to something like this while dreading it at the same time. As far as it's on, they're selecting the jury tomorrow. Apparently, they didn't have enough jurors to show up today. The idea of going to trial haunted me. Not only did I have to look at the man who took so much life out of me and my family, but I would have to rewatch him doing this through the videos he took. I felt humiliated, angry, and depressed about the way I was being portrayed in front of a room of strangers. They look at those videos of me and they're like, are you sure that wasn't consensual? And it's like, why would I be here right now? Why would I be trying so hard? Why would I be putting up with this for the last 4 years of my life? Trial ended up being one of the most destructive parts of this entire process. The court didn't allow me to be there for my trial outside of my own testimony, since my presence could potentially influence other witnesses' testimonies. So I got to hear all the details from my family who sat through it all. I had an option to let a court-appointed person go in my place to give my testimony, but I knew the reality. If I wasn't there, it would be used against me. To not show up would discredit my validity as a victim.
The purpose for imposing a sentence is to punish conduct. I don't think he's sorry for it. Maybe he is. I just don't see that.
The jury found him guilty of 2 felony charges. Two months after, I was given the option to address my rapist. This is called a victim impact statement, similar to what the dozens of women did at the Dr. Nassar sentencing. It's your chance to address the court and address the accused.
I can never wish what happened to me upon another person. If I ever have a daughter, will she experience something like this? Will she be unlucky enough to meet someone like you?
My rapist was sentenced up to 6 years in federal prison and will remain on the sex offender registry for the rest of his life. And while my case is seen as a victory in the eyes of our legal system, my story sadly represents a small minority of cases. This is one of the many reasons we do not see other women coming forward. Regardless of all the evidence, court appearances, and having the freaking LA District Attorney's Office on my side, it was still barely enough to put my rapist behind bars. I'm a cisgender white woman who reported my rape, and this is the reality I faced. So what does this mean for the rest of survivors who don't fit my exact profile? To remind you, 78% of rapes are not reported. And women of color, who are even more likely to be assaulted, are even less likely to report these incidents. And who can blame them? I'm not sharing my story to discourage others to come forward or to downplay the efforts of those who are fighting for sexual assault survivors. I have immense gratitude for those people who work in these thankless roles and who dedicate their lives to help people like me. I'm sharing my story because my experience doesn't have to be everyone's experience. We need to change the way these cases are processed and the way all survivors are handled. It took the strength of other women coming forward before me to share my story with you, and I hope mine can help the next one.
Okay, so what we heard from her was her experience while the case was going to trial. So that's what we're going to be discussing in the next few slides. So, trial procedure, how does this affect victims? So, many aspects, as we saw in the video, many aspects of the adversarial process in the United States have been linked to harmful consequences for victims during court proceedings. As we saw, everything that the courts threw at her had an impact on her experience as a victim. So not only did the crime have an impact on her, but then the process she had to go through to get justice also impacted her life and made her become more of a victim than she already was. So throughout trial procedure, victims' identities become public record, and they may have personal details of their personal life presented in court. Victims may be required to testify in court in the presence of their offender and spectators. So they're going to have to relive that whole situation that is the most traumatic experience of their life. They have to relive it in front of people that they've never seen before and in front of the person who caused all this pain. So victims may also have to confront police and witnesses, and they may be required to provide details of the crime, which can lead to secondary trauma. Another issue that victims face in trial procedure are defense attorneys. So the defense attorney's job is to question the credibility and the validity of the statements that the victim is making. So the defense attorney can aggressively question the victim's character. And it's very common in cases of sexual assault. And as she said, the attorney may even question consent. So like she had said in the video, they had replayed these videos of her assault. And after that, they would ask her if she was sure that that was not consent. So apart from this, the accused has the right to confront or cross-examine the witness, and some defendants choose to self-represent. So in this case, they would be the ones cross-examining the victim or cross-examining, witnesses. Defendants have admitted in the past that they choose to self-represent specifically because it would allow this confrontation. And several state courts actually require survivors of sexual assault to physically look at their abusers in the eyes while they're being cross-examined by a self-representing defendant. And defendants may also fill the courtroom with observers that they specifically chose to intimidate the victim. So they might fill it up with their own family members, with gang members, or just any individual that may be hostile towards the victim to intimidate the victim during the trial. And sometimes the victim's request to not face the defendant might be denied due to the Sixth Amendment. So, in what other ways does the trial procedure promote secondary victimization? So, there's also the failure of the prosecutor's office to keep victims informed. So, sometimes prosecutors fail to provide case details. They fail to provide information regarding pretrial proceedings or any postponements to the trial. They also fail to provide information on plea offers or sentencing decisions. And victims struggle with the idea that, court dates can be postponed multiple times. Sometimes this can even be a tactic on the defense's part. So as we saw in the video, there were many times where, proceedings were rescheduled, and she even went personally to request that the defendant's wishes weren't granted and that they didn't keep rescheduling or postponing any of the proceedings. Another part of trial procedure that has a negative effect on victims is dropped cases by prosecutors, and also, prosecutors agreeing on plea bargains that drop the more serious charges in exchange for a guilty plea. Also, victims sometimes seem to not understand the relationship between them and the prosecutor. They initially believe that their relationship with the prosecutor would be equivalent to the relationship of the defendant and the defense attorney. Victims sometimes believe that the prosecutor is their legal counsel. However, the objective of the prosecutor is to successfully prosecute the case, and this may sometimes not be beneficial to the victim. Because prosecutors may drop more difficult or controversial cases because of the need to divert cases from overcrowded courts or the need to meet performance targets. There is also a collaboration between prosecutors and defense attorneys, and this also affects victims, such as plea bargains. When plea bargains come into play, the prosecutor and the defendant come to an agreement that the victim isn't aware of, and therefore they feel as if, they have no one on their side defending them, while the actual defendant, the person who caused all of this, does have someone on their side looking out for their best interest. So, how does victim input connect to secondary victimization? So the only real input that victims have in their decision to report, the only real input that victims have are their decision to report the crime and their testimony at trial. And the vast majority of cases are settled through plea bargains, so victims sometimes may not be called to testify. However, research has found that participating in the trial can help victims deal with their victimization. It allows them to have increased feelings of self-determination and control. So although many of the procedures in a trial negatively affects victims, just being able to see justice come about does help them get through their victimization. And prosecutors also often fail to include victim statements as a part of plea bargain decisions. So that's another way that victim input isn't taken into consideration. Judges also may not take the statement into consideration. And the US Constitution outlines many rights for defendants, but not many for victims when it comes to procedures in trial. And when the rights of the victim conflict with the rights of the rights of the defendant always take priority, such as when victims decide that they don't want to face the defendant. Sometimes that's refused because that would be infringing upon the defendant's Sixth Amendment. So what I want you to take out of all of this is that the criminal justice system is defendant focused and it's not victim focused. So let's talk about homicide survivors and secondary victimization. So the families of homicide victims have a long-lasting contact with the criminal justice system. So it does take a very long time for a homicide case to be resolved. And throughout this whole time, the families are involved in the case. And the system focuses more on processing offenders than on the needs of the victims, especially when the victims are not the direct or primary victims. This negatively affects the victim's ability to grieve and heal from their loss. And many victims feel as if they have to put their grief on hold. Homicide survivors feel that there are negative interactions with the police. When it comes to this process, they feel that there is a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion. And they feel that insensitive treatment by police is the source of their trauma and is linked to a prolonged grieving process. Survivors also struggle with a lack of involvement with and control over criminal proceedings. The survivors' interests are less important than the prosecution and the need of the state. For example, families who do not support capital punishment lack input into whether the offender is sentenced to death or life without parole. And survivors are excluded from the plea bargaining process as well. Restrictions are also placed upon survivors when they're in the courtroom. So when they're testifying, for example, they're prevented from attending portions of the trial. And they're also told that they must not show emotion while they're in the courtroom. And if they do show emotion, they'll be removed from the courtroom. The victim impact statement also has a couple of limitations. So a victim impact statement is a written or oral statement that allows crime victims the opportunity to speak during the sentencing process. So some of the limitations that are placed on their statements are the content of the statement itself. And, another limitation is where they stand within the courtroom and whether they're facing the defendant or not. Let's see. Okay, so what we're gonna do now, let me just unshare the presentation. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do another in-class activity. So based off of everything that I just said, based off of the videos that you just watched, I am going to put you into breakout rooms. And I'm going to ask that you explain to me the role of secondary victimization. Well, no, secondary victimization and the role of police, the role of trial procedure, and the role of victim input. Okay, so I'm gonna break you out into those groups, and I just need you to give me a quick recap of what we talked about for each of those things. So group 1 is going to focus on interactions with police. Group 2 is going to focus on trial procedure, and group 3 will focus on victim input, okay? So I'm going to give you about maybe 5 to 10 minutes to do this, and then we'll go ahead and reconvene. Hi, group 1. So you're assigned interactions with police. So I just need you to quickly give me a recap of what we talked about regarding interactions with the police and secondary victimization. It can be very quick. You can choose one spokesperson to just speak about everything you all discussed while you were in the breakout room, okay? You have about 5 minutes, 5 to 10, more so 5. But if you need more time, let me know and I'll give you more time, okay? Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing? Okay, group 2. So you're assigned trial procedures. So what I need you to do is just discuss what we addressed during the presentation, during the video. I just need you to give me a quick recap of what trial procedure has to do with secondary victimization. Okay, so just remember, this is when we talked about the courts. This is when we saw the video regarding the victim's interactions with the court, you know, how she had to fly back and ask them to stop granting the defendant's wishes. So just give me a quick recap on that, okay? Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay, perfect. If you have any questions, just join the main room and ask me your question. I'll answer it, and then you can jump back into your breakout room. Hi, everyone. So group 3, you're assigned victim input. This is what we talked about at the very end. So you can just address what we spoke about regarding the victim impact statement and things of that sort. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, so if anyone has any questions in the next, 5 minutes while we're working on this, just jump back into the main room and then you can go back to your breakout room once I answer your question. Thank you. Hi, group 1. Sorry, I'm joining your group once again just to give you a bit more information. I had jumped into breakout room 2 and breakout room 3 and gave them a bit of information as to what I'm looking for. And I don't think I gave you all enough information. So remember that we talked about police interactions at the very beginning of the lecture. So this is basically what was discussed when we did the first activity. So, that distrust with police and what reactions police have to the victims. So I just need you to quickly discuss that. And if you have any questions, just make sure, sorry, I know you see just my fingertips, but just jump back into the main room. If you have any questions, I'll answer your questions as best as I can, and then once you have your questions answered, you can join your breakout room again. Okay, you have about, well, the clock is ticking, but 5 minutes. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So you did have your 5 minutes to go ahead and go over all of that information. So can group 1 tell me the relationship between secondary victimization and interactions with police? Okay, great. So you mentioned that one of the effects that police interactions can have with the victim is that the police officer can determine whether the crime was actually deemed a criminal offense or not. And sometimes what can have an effect on this decision is age, race, socioeconomic status, level of distress, and history of substance abuse. Okay, perfect. That was great. Group 2, can you give me one of the things that you talked about regarding trial procedure and secondary victimization? Okay. Okay, so you discussed how the victim has to face the defendant sometimes and how the defendant can represent themselves and they can cross-examine any witnesses and anything of that sort, and that can have an effect on the victim and the experience that the victim had. You also mentioned how defense attorneys are aggressive towards victims and how that can impact the victim's experience and it can question their credibility and consent as well. Okay, perfect. Can group 3 tell me about victim input as it relates to secondary victimization? Okay. Okay, great. So you mentioned how sometimes when it comes to things like plea bargains, that victims do not have a say in this. You also gave the example that was given in class about homicide families and capital punishment and how they don't have a say on whether the defendant gets death or life without parole. Okay, perfect, perfect. Those were all very great answers. Thank you for participating and, thank you for working together as a team and being able to recap what we talked about in the lesson. So, your assignment, remember you have an assignment due Sunday at 11:59. I'll have all of the instructions posted on Canvas. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to send me an email. I'll try my best to respond to you within 24 hours, but being that today is Tuesday, you do have all the way until Sunday, you have a couple days to do the assignment. So please make sure you reach out to me with time so I can give you a proper response. But the details, the instructions will be very detailed in Canvas. So if you have any questions, just send me an email, okay? Okay, perfect. I hope everybody has a great day. I'll see you next week, Tuesday. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.